Dropping a stitch from your long tail when you're working across your first row is a bummer, but it's not the end of the world. To understand how we can fix a dropped long tail cast on stitch, all we have to do is think about how we pick up a dropped stitch in knitting and the structure of long tail. Let's take a look. Now, when we're doing long tail, we're really knitting a row. So it's helpful to remind ourselves of how we pick up a drop stitch in knitting when it hasn't run away. Well, if I've only got one little bitty drop stitch, I'm not going to grab a crochet hook. I'm going to pop that drop stitch onto my knitting needle, and I'm going to drape the working yarn over the tip of my needle, and I'm going to lift the drop stitch up and over, and I've restored it. Now let's take a closer look at long tail. So the first thing I want you to see is these two pieces of yarn coming from the needle. That's going to look very familiar when we look at a drop stitch. Now what we're doing when we do long tail is we're knitting. When we move our needle to the outside of the thumb yarn and up into the stitch, we make a little twist in that yarn and we've entered a stitch on the needle, and we use the back yarn to knit with it. That's what we're doing when we do long tail. So the piece of yarn in the front has a twist in it, and then we knit with it. Remember that when we fix it. Now that we've carefully examined long tail, I think what happens when we drop a stitch is going to look very familiar. Ah! See those two pieces of yarn? Now really think about what it looks like when you're doing long tail. Look familiar? Now the first thing we're going to do if I'm working flat is I'm going to turn it around to the knit side. If I'm working in the round, I can leave it exactly where it is. But we know it's always easier to ladder up a stitch from the knit side. Now you're going to notice that the strand closer to you is a little lower and looks a little shorter. Well, if we think about it, that's the piece of yarn that we made a twist in, and then the piece of yarn in the back is what we knit with. So I'm going to make a twist. I'm going to take my knitting needle and I'm going to put it right between the two strands, and I'm going to put the stitch onto my knitting needle. Now I'm going to take the working yarn and drape it over the tip of my needle, just like we did when we picked up a drop stitch. Now by grabbing that trailing leg, the leg that's farthest away from the tip of the needle, and lifting it up and over, I've made the twist in that stitch and I've picked up my drop stitch. Now remember, we were working our way across a wrong side row, so I'm going to transfer that back to the left needle and continue. Let's take a look at that one more time in slow motion. And that's all there is to it. Remember, when you understand how something is built, you know how to fix it.